She never removed her right glove, not even to dine. And for 4 months, the household at Ashcombe Fell had learned not to ask why. Mrs. Prynne, the housekeeper, had raised the question once, gently, in her first week, and had been met with a composure so complete it discouraged further inquiry. Adelina Marsh, 22, sat each evening at the foot of a table she was not permitted to speak at unless spoken to, her spine straight as a rod, her gloved hand folded over its naked twin in her lap, and waited for the meal to end so she might return to the cold corridor that housed the undermaids, several steps below, where a companion of her supposed rank ought properly to have slept. She was not a guest. She was not quite a servant either, though the Dowager Lady Roswitha Ashcombe had made certain everyone below stairs understood her as one in all but name. She was, officially, a poor relation taken in out of charity, a companion of no particular use, and the glove, she had been told upon her arrival, was an eccentricity to be tolerated so long as it caused no comment at table. It caused a great deal of comment. It was simply never spoken aloud, for the Dowager permitted no subject at her table that she herself had not first raised. The Duke of Ashcombe had not looked at her directly in 4 months. This, too, was tolerated and understood, and had ceased some weeks ago to sting her the way it once had, in the first fortnight, when she had still nursed some foolish hope of being seen as a person, and not merely as an inconvenient obligation discharged. His Grace, Rowan Ashcombe, 37, moved through his own house like a man walking the perimeter of a wound he had long since stopped examining. He had buried his wife, Duchess Isolde, 3 years past, in the frozen ground behind the chapel at Ashcombe Fell, on a morning so cold the gravedigger's breath had hung in the air like smoke, and he had buried, with her, whatever version of himself had once laughed easily in that same dining hall. What remained was competent, cold, and precise. He managed his estate as a man manages an illness he has accepted will not improve, thoroughly, joylessly, without complaint. He did not remarry, though his mother pressed him weekly, sometimes daily, producing names of eligible young women with the relentlessness of a woman conducting a campaign. He did not travel, though his solicitor urged it, arguing that London society had all but forgotten his face, and that forgetting, in a duke, was a dangerous thing. He did not, above all, permit himself to notice the quiet young woman his mother had installed as a companion 4 months prior, whose right hand never once, in all that time, met open air. Not at breakfast, not at needlework, not even, the housekeeper had once whispered to the cook, while she slept. It would be many weeks before he learned why. Ashcombe Fell sat upon a Northumberland crag the way a fortress sits upon a decision it no longer remembers making. Grey stone against a greyer sky, narrow windows built for defence rather than light, a wind that came off the moor in long, unbroken gusts and found every seam in every door, every gap beneath every casement, so that even in high summer a fire burned somewhere in the house at all hours. The Dowager Lady Roswitha ruled its corridors with the particular ruthlessness of a woman who had once been beautiful and powerful and now retained only the second quality, having watched her looks fade into a severity of feature that servants privately called handsome, in the way one calls a hawk handsome. She had taken in her late husband's grandniece, one Miss Adelina Marsh, ostensibly as an act of Christian charity, following the death of the girl's father, a country parson of no fortune and less consequence, dead of a lung fever the previous winter. In fact, Lady Roswitha had taken her in to control her, to watch her, and, though she would not have admitted this even to her confessor, to keep close a girl she suspected of knowing something the family could not afford to have spoken beyond these walls. What no one in that house yet understood was that Adelina Marsh was not, in fact, the parson's daughter at all. Not in blood, whatever the parish records of her upbringing might say. She was, in blood and in law, the granddaughter of the late Duke's own sister, Lady Honoria Ashcombe, disowned 40 years past for a marriage the family had called beneath her, to a schoolmaster of all unthinkable things. Her existence quietly erased from the Ashcombe succession before Rowan himself was born, so thoroughly that not even the family solicitors retained record of her having existed. Adelina had learned the truth only 18 months prior, from a dying great-aunt in Carlisle, who had pressed a sealed packet of letters into her hands with fingers already going cold, and whispered an address in Northumberland, and made her swear upon her mother's grave that she would go there and learn the whole of it before it was lost forever. She had come to Ashcombe Fell not for charity, but for confirmation, and had found, upon arrival, a household so thoroughly governed by fear of exposure, so carefully arranged around silences she did not yet understand, that she judged discretion, for the present, the wiser course. She would learn what she needed to know. She would not yet claim what was owed her. And she would keep, always, upon her right hand, the one object that could prove every word of it beyond any court's or clergyman's doubt: her grandmother's signet ring, cast in Ashcombe gold 100 years before, engraved with the Ashcombe falcon rising, worn beneath a glove, because a servant's hand bearing a duke's own crest would raise questions she was not yet prepared to answer, not to a household that watched her already with the particular suspicion reserved for poor relations who might, one day, prove inconveniently entitled to something. She had been raised to expect one thing. She received another. The dinner that would change everything began, as most catastrophes at Ashcombe Fell began, with Lady Roswitha in a temper. This one occasioned by a bishop's visit the following week, and the dowager's conviction that every detail of the household must reflect flawlessly upon her son's consequence. "You will remove that absurdity at my table," the dowager said, not looking up from her soup, her spoon moving with the small, precise violence of a woman accustomed to obedience. "Or you will take your meals in the kitchen, where such affectations go unremarked, and the Bishop of Durham need never learn we harbour eccentrics beneath this roof." Adelina set down her own spoon with the particular stillness of a woman who has rehearsed this exact humiliation in her mind 100 times, and found it, upon arrival, smaller than she had feared, though it still cost her something to hold her voice level. "I am comfortable as I am, my lady." "You are comfortable," Lady Roswitha repeated, each word laid down like a coin counted out in payment of a debt. "Because you have never known what discomfort truly costs a woman in your position. A position, I remind you, exists entirely at my son's pleasure and my own charity." "Rowan," she turned, sharp, toward her son at the head of the table, her voice sharpening further into command. "Tell her." The Duke lifted his eyes for the first time in 4 months, and found, across 30 feet of mahogany and candlelight, a face he had trained himself, with considerable effort, not to see. Adelina Marsh was not beautiful in the manner the ton prized, not golden, not soft, not designed for flattery in drawing rooms. Her features were too composed, her mouth held too firmly for that. But she held his gaze without flinching, without the small performance of deference he had come to expect from every woman his mother produced for his inspection. And something in the sheer directness of it struck him with the particular force of a man walking into a door he had entirely forgotten was there. "I have no opinion on the matter of gloves, mother," he said, and returned to his soup, though his eyes did not immediately return with them. It was the first sentence he had spoken to her, however indirectly, since her arrival 4 months prior. She did not smile. She did not look pleased, precisely, for she had learned already that pleasure displayed too openly in this house invited its own punishment. She only inclined her head, once, the way a woman inclines her head to a small mercy she has not asked for and does not wholly trust. And the meal continued in the particular silence of a house built, board by board and generation by generation, on things unsaid. Had anyone been watching closely, they might have seen the Duke's eyes return to her twice more before the fish course was cleared, and a third time as the footman brought round the port, though he would have denied it had anyone been so bold as to remark upon it, which no one at Ashcombe Fell was. The rain came in earnest the following week, the kind of Northumberland rain that turned the moor to black glass and drove every soul in the house indoors for days at a stretch, rattling the casements and finding its way, in thin, persistent streams, down chimney flues that had stood 400 years and never quite mastered the trick of keeping weather entirely at bay. It was during this confinement that the first crack appeared. Not in the Duke's armor, which remained as ever formidable and entire, but in the ordinary machinery of the house, which required someone competent to manage it, while the housekeeper lay abed with a fever that would not break, and the steward, caught upon the road to Newcastle when the weather turned, could not now return before the roads cleared, taking with him the week's accounts and every arrangement for provisioning a house of 40 souls through a storm that showed no sign of relenting. Lady Roswitha, predictably, did nothing but complain, first of the cold, then of the inadequate fires, then of a headache she attributed to the general incompetence of everyone beneath her notice, and retired to her rooms to be attended by her maid, leaving the household to manage as it might. It was Adelina who took the ledgers from the under-housekeeper's trembling and inexperienced hands, who sat by candlelight recalculating the week's provisioning against the delayed supply, who instructed that the underused east wing be closed off entirely to conserve coal, redirecting its fires to the servants' hall instead, and who did all of this with the brisk, unshowy competence of a woman who had, in fact, been raised managing her own father's meagre parsonage accounts from the age of 12, stretching a curate's stipend across a parish's worth of need, and had simply never before had occasion to demonstrate the skill in a house of this scale, or before an audience that mattered. The Duke found her in the estate office past midnight, 3 days into the confinement. A single candle burned low beside a stack of figures she had reconciled, without being asked, without complaint, and, he noted, with the particular attention of a man who managed his own affairs closely and recognized true competence when he encountered it. Without a single error in arithmetic that his own steward, for all his 11 years of service, regularly made and regularly excused. "You did this," he said, standing in the doorway with the particular stillness of a man uncertain whether he is intruding. It was not quite a question. "Someone had to, Your Grace. The house does not run itself, whatever your mother believes. And I should think you would rather know the coal will last the month than discover otherwise when it does not." He was quiet a long moment, studying the columns of figures set down in her small, precise hand, each entry checked twice and initialed in the margin. "My steward has managed this estate for 11 years, and has never once balanced the coal accounts to the farthing. I confess I did not know it possible." "Then your steward has never had cause to be careful with another man's coal," Adelina said, and there was, in the words, no flattery and no apology, only a flat and unhurried truth that he found, against every instinct trained into him by 3 years of careful numbness, oddly restful to hear. The way a man finds it restful, after long illness, to hear a plain diagnosis rather than another comforting falsehood. He did not thank her, not in so many words. He was not yet a man who thanked easily, having grown unpracticed in the small courtesies of ordinary gratitude. But he did not leave the office for some time after, asking her, instead, 3 further questions about the tenant cottages on the eastern boundary. Questions she answered with the same unhesitating clarity. And when he finally withdrew, he took the ledger with him, and read it again by his own fire, long past 2 in the morning, and found himself, for the first time in longer than he could readily account, thinking of a woman's hands, rather than his dead wife's face, and troubled, faintly, by how little that troubled him. But the season was not yet finished with either of them. Lady Roswitha's temper, denied its usual target at dinner for a full week, found new avenues in which to work itself out. She began, within the fortnight, a quiet campaign to have Adelina removed from the house entirely. First, by suggesting to her son, over breakfast, that a companion of such presumption ought to be found a suitable post elsewhere, perhaps in a respectable family in the south, where her heirs might go unremarked, and, when this failed to move him beyond a cool and non-committal silence, by writing, without consulting anyone, to a cousin in Newcastle who kept a school for governesses, arranging a position that would remove the girl from Ashcombe Fell entirely within the month, the letter of confirmation already dispatched before Adelina so much as learned of the scheme. She did this, she told herself, lying awake in her vast, cold bed, for the good of the family, for her son's consequence, for the ordinary preservation of a household's proper order. She did it, in truth, because some old and buried instinct, sharpened by 40 years of vigilance, told her that the parson's daughter watched the house with eyes that knew more than she ought, that she asked, in her quiet way, questions no ordinary poor relation would think to ask, about old family portraits, about the chapel register, about a name, Honoria, that Lady Roswitha had not heard spoken aloud in her presence in 4 decades, and did not care to hear spoken now. She had spent 40 years ensuring that certain doors at Ashcombe Fell remained shut, and she recognized, with the particular dread of a woman who has buried something and fears its resurrection, the look of someone standing before one of those doors with her hand upon the latch. It was a housemaid, one Bess, loyal to Adelina in the particular way servants become loyal to those few above them who treat them as people rather than furniture, who brought word of the arranged post 3 days before the letter confirming it was to arrive, having overheard the dowager dictating terms to her own maid. "She means to send me away," Adelina said to no one, standing at her narrow window above the moor, watching the rain streak sideways across glass so old it distorted the world beyond into something wavering and uncertain, and felt, for the first time since her arrival, the true weight of what she stood to lose. Not merely a roof over her head, however grudging, but her single chance to learn the whole truth of her grandmother's disownment before the last witnesses to it, elderly and failing in a Carlisle almshouse, died, and took the truth with them into ground that would keep it as silent as the Ashcombe Chapel had kept Honoria's name. What no one yet understood, least of all the dowager, was that a woman with nothing left to lose makes a very different calculation than one still hoping to be spared. What followed would not be spoken of for a generation, though its consequences would echo through every branch of the Ashcombe family for the whole of it. Adelina did not go to the Duke. Not yet. Not with nothing but her own word to offer against his mother's 40 years of careful denial. She went, instead, on the 3rd night of that same storm, to the old chapel behind the house, where the family dead lay under simple stones worn soft by centuries of Northumberland weather, and where, she had learned from her great-aunt's letters, a side chamber built into the vestry held the parish register recording every Ashcombe birth, marriage, and burial back 3 centuries, kept under lock by the family rather than the parish on account of its sensitivity. She went at dusk, in the rain, without a lamp she dared not carry, lest its light be seen flickering from the house and draw a servant's curious eye, feeling her way along the chapel wall by memory and touch, her gloved hand and her bare hand alike numb with cold by the time she reached the vestry door, which some long-dead sexton's carelessness had left with the lock easily forced by a hairpin and a steady hand. She found the register's brittle pages, by the last grey light through a narrow window, the entry she had crossed 400 miles to confirm. The marriage, in 1841, of one Honoria Ashcombe, only sister of the 11th Duke, to a Mr. Thomas Marsh, a schoolmaster of no fortune, in a small parish near Carlisle, rather than at Ashcombe Fell itself, as though the family had known even then it wished the union kept from its own doorstep. And beneath it, in a different, later hand, the single word, expunged, struck through the original entry in ink gone brown with age, and a date some months following, and an initial that matched, unmistakably, when set beside a ledger she had seen in the estate office not a week prior, the maiden signature of the woman who now called herself Dowager Lady Roswitha Ashcombe. She had known the marriage was true. Her great-aunt's letters had told her that much, and more. She had not known, until that moment, kneeling on cold stone with rain finding its way through some ancient crack in the roof to fall upon the very page she read, but the woman who wished her gone from this house was the very hand that had erased her grandmother from the family's history in the first place, and would, given a fortnight more, erase Adelina too, quietly, completely, the way one erases an inconvenient entry from a ledger that no one thinks to check. The Duke found her there an hour later, having noticed her absence from the evening's meagre supper, and grown, against his own inclination, uneasy enough to go looking, soaped through and shaking with cold rather than fear, the register open upon her lap, where she had not moved in some time, transfixed by what she had found. It was in that moment, candleless, sodden, entirely undefended, stripped of every careful composure she had maintained for 4 months, that he saw her, for the first time, not as a companion of uncertain and faintly suspect position, but as a woman carrying a weight he did not yet understand. And something in him that had been frozen solid for 3 years cracked audibly in his own chest, like ice giving way beneath a boot upon a winter pond. "You will catch your death," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, and stripped his own greatcoat from his shoulders and settled it, without asking leave, around hers, his hands lingering a moment longer than strict necessity required at her shoulders. And the gesture, unthinking, immediate, utterly unlike the careful, measured man she had come to know across 4 months of downcast eyes and clipped civility, undid something in her own composure that 4 months of careful silence had not managed to touch. "Your Grace, I must show you something, and I do not know how to soften it, nor whether it ought to be softened at all." "Then do not soften it," he said, lowering himself onto the cold stone beside her, without regard for his own coat, now doing double duty around her shoulders instead of his. "I have had a bellyful of things softened for my comfort these 3 years past. My mother softens, my solicitor softens. Show me the thing itself." She showed him the register, her finger tracing the expunged entry, the date, the initial. She told him, in the chapel's cold dark, with the rain still finding its thin way through the roof above them, everything she had held silent for 4 months. Her true parentage, her grandmother's disownment, and the schoolmaster she had loved enough to be cast off for. The letters her dying great-aunt had pressed into her hands. And, last, drawing off her glove at last with fingers gone stiff from cold and from 4 months of habit, the ring she now placed in his open palm. The Ashcombe falcon rising, unmistakable, cut into gold that had not seen daylight in 40 years. He turned it over in his fingers for a long while in the dim light, saying nothing. And when he spoke at last, his voice had gone rough in a way she had not yet heard from him in all their brief exchanges. "My mother did this. I did not come to accuse her, Your Grace. I came only to know the truth of my own grandmother, which is a different thing entirely from wishing your mother's ruin. And now that you have it, now that you hold proof enough to unseat 40 years of careful silence, and every acre and shilling that silence protected." Adelina, 22, cold to the bone, closed her bare right hand, bare now for the first time in 4 months, in front of another living soul, around nothing at all, and found the answer had been decided in her some while before she knew to ask it of herself, perhaps from the very night she had first sat at his table, and watched him look at her as though she were furniture, and found, to her own considerable surprise, that she minded rather more than the mere insult of it warranted. "I find I would rather have your good opinion, Your Grace, than your family's fortune, which I do not want, and never came here for. I would rather you knew me honestly, as a woman with nothing to recommend her but a ring and a dead schoolmaster's blood, than have you owe me anything by mere operation of law." It was not until she had said it aloud that she understood how thoroughly it was true, and how little she had expected, 4 months prior, ever to feel such a thing about a man who had not once looked at her directly across his own dinner table. The Duke of Ashcombe, who had not permitted himself an unguarded feeling in 3 years, not since the frozen morning he had watched his wife's coffin lowered into ground he had chosen himself, looked at the woman before him, soaked, shivering, holding nothing back for the first time since her arrival, and felt the last of his careful architecture, built board by board over 3 years, the way the house itself had been built, stone by stone over centuries, give way entirely, all at once, in a single unguarded breath. "Then you shall have both," he said. "For I find I have wanted neither fortune nor family, half so much, these 4 months, as I have wanted to see your hand without its glove, and I did not permit myself to know why until this very moment, kneeling on cold stone in my family's own chapel, which strikes me now as precisely where such a reckoning ought to occur." Lady Roswitha did not yield easily, nor swiftly, nor with any grace whatsoever. Confronted the following morning in her own sitting room with the register, the ring, and her own son's cold fury, a fury more devastating for how rarely he raised his voice above its ordinary, measured register, she attempted first denial, insisting the register must be misread, then justification, insisting the discernment had preserved the family from a scandal that would have diminished them all in the eyes of the whole county, that Honoria's marriage beneath her station to a man of no name and less fortune would have undone 3 generations of careful advancement, that she had acted always and only for Ashcombe's good and never her own comfort. "You erased my aunt from her own family's memory," the Duke said, standing before the cold hearth of his mother's sitting room, with a stillness more frightening than any shout. "Struck her from a parish register, as though she had never drawn breath, and installed her granddaughter as an unpaid servant in the very house that was rightfully half her inheritance by her own mother's marriage settlement. And you did this, Mother, not for Ashcombe's good, but for your own comfort, in never having to answer for what you did to your husband's sister 4 decades ago. That comfort ends today, whatever else does not." He did not cast his mother out, though he considered it, and said as much aloud, coldly, watching her face for the first time in years with something other than filial deference. Adelina, when consulted that same afternoon in the estate office where their acquaintance had first properly begun, would not permit that particular cruelty. Arguing with the same flat, unhurried practicality she had brought to the coal accounts, that a public reckoning would harm the family name Adelina herself now stood, by the restored register, to inherit a share of, and that quiet correction, administered privately and permanently, served justice rather better in the end than a public ruin, but would stain her own restored name along with the dowager's. It was, the Duke reflected privately, walking the length of the long gallery that evening, past portraits that would soon include one long missing from its wall, precisely the kind of grace his mother had never once extended to anyone in the whole of her life, and precisely the reason he found himself, daily now, seeking Adelina's counsel on matters far beyond the household ledgers that had first revealed her competence to him. The solicitors were engaged within the fortnight, summoned from Newcastle, and sworn to a discretion the Duke paid handsomely to ensure. The register's expunged entry was formally examined, witnessed, and restored under proper legal authority, the strike-through ink noted and dated in a fresh hand alongside it, rather than erased in turn, for the Duke was resolved that no Ashcombe record would again be altered to suit a convenient silence. Adelina Marsh, in law now confirmed as Adelina Ashcombe, granddaughter of Lady Honoria Ashcombe, and cousin twice removed to the Duke himself, was found by the restored settlement to be heir to a modest, but entirely real, portion of the Ashcombe estate, her grandmother's own marriage articles had specified 4 decades before, and which had simply never been paid out, the sum having sat, all that time, quietly accruing in a trust the family solicitors had maintained, without ever once being asked why. She found herself, for the first time in her 22 years, standing in a house with an acknowledged name to her own, and money enough, modest as it was, to leave it entirely if she so chose, which fact the Duke found, upon reflection, both terrifying and strangely reassuring, for it meant that whatever she chose thereafter, she chose freely. She did not marry the Duke for 6 months more, through a spring that brought the first green to the moor, and a summer that softened, by slow degrees, even Ashcombe Fell's grey stone. He would not permit himself to ask, until every particle of doubt had been settled, that she came to him by genuine choice, and not by some misplaced gratitude for what his family's own past wrongdoing had restored to her. And she, for her part, would not permit herself to answer until she was entirely certain the offer, when it came, was made to a woman he had watched balance a coal ledger by candlelight, and not merely to a name now respectably attached to gold and an ancient falcon crest. It was, both privately agreed on the several occasions they discussed it, with the same plain candour that had first drawn them together, precisely the kind of caution their 2 families' tangled history had rather thoroughly earned. He asked her, in the end, in the chapel where he had first seen her unguarded, not on bended knee, not with ceremony or witnesses, but with the same plain directness she had shown him that rain-soaked night nearly a year before. "I find I no longer wish to see you at the foot of my table, Adelina, admitted there only on my mother's uncertain sufferance. I wish to see you at the head of it, beside me, for the whole of my life. And I wish it not because the law now says you are entitled to a place in this house by blood, but because I have not drawn an entirely easy breath since the night you showed me that register upon this very stone, and I do not believe I shall again, unless you consent to stay for good." "You are certain," she said, though the corner of her mouth had begun, despite herself, to soften towards something very like a smile, "that it is not merely the ring you wish restored to the family, dressed up handsomely as a proposal of marriage?" "I am entirely certain," he said, "that I would want you precisely as you are if you arrived at my door tomorrow with nothing but the clothes upon your back and no name at all to recommend you. And I have spent the better part of 6 months proving that certainty to myself, in private, before I dared bring it to you in the light of day." She placed her bare right hand in his then. The falcon ring restored now to its proper place upon it, worn openly at last after 4 months' concealment, and said only, "Then I am certain too, Your Grace, and have been for rather longer than either of us has been willing to say aloud." They were married the following autumn, in the same chapel behind the house, under the same worn stones that had held, for 40 years, the truth Lady Roswitha had tried so carefully to bury. And the dowager, present at the ceremony but visibly chastened, her authority in the household quietly and permanently diminished, watched her son wed the granddaughter of the very sister she had erased, and understood at last, watching the ring catch candlelight upon a hand no longer gloved, that some debts, left unpaid long enough, come due in the end. With interest, no fortune however vast can settle, except the plain and costly coin of honesty, finally paid in full. Years later, when their own daughter was old enough to ask why the portrait of her great-great-aunt Honoria hung newly restored in the long gallery, in a space where once there had been only a pale rectangle of unfaded wallpaper, marking an absence no one had ever explained to her, Adelina would tell her the whole of it, unhurried, exactly as it had happened. The glove, the register, the ring, the rain that would not stop falling on the one night it mattered most, and would end, always, with the same words her husband had once said to her in a cold chapel on the worst and best night of her life. Words she had carried with her through every season since. There are arrangements, and there are marriages, and the two are rarely the same thing at all. We were fortunate enough, in the end, to have both turn out to be one and the same. The falcon ring passed, in time, to that daughter, and to her daughter after her. Each one told the story in turn, upon her own 22nd year. And the register, in the chapel's side chamber, was never again permitted to hold an expunged name, whatever the cost to any family's comfort, for as long as an Ashcombe walked the halls of the Fell.